Before we dive into our first module, we really should conclude this part of our discussion with Drupal coding standards. Some of the benefits of coding standards, if you've done any coding at all, of course, open source, a lot of community support, the extensibility. The main documentation for coding standards in Drupal is at drupal.org/coding-standards. Drupal 8 uses PHP, Twig, Symfony, .yaml files, doc blocks, and PSR-4 namespaces, all of which have their own syntax requirements and guidelines. Let's take a look at a few of those, and I'm going to offer up a lot of links at the end of this session. In fact, there's a lot of information on the screens in this video, so you might want to pause and take down some of those links. All right, let's talk about file structure and naming first. Each class must be in its own file within the /src folder. You'll see that in our first module. The file should be named after its class, so for instance, foointerface.php, complete with capitalization, one class or interface or trait per file, and we don't use Drupal or class in the name at all. Interfaces should end with interface.php, and test class names should end in test.php. We'll do some of those as we go. Classes and namespaces. Classes must use a namespace starting with /Drupal/module_name. So, for instance, if your name is my_module, then it'll be /Drupal/my_module. Classes autoload based on PSR-4 namespacing convention, and the tree for module starts under module name /src. When using a class that's in a different namespace, declare it at the top of your file with use. Once again, we'll do that in our examples today. Methods and properties of classes must specify their visibility. I've mentioned that before. The use of public properties is discouraged. It can defeat the purpose of object-oriented programming. Protected or private properties and methods should not use an underscore prefix. Make sure you use type hinting when a function or method requires conformity to a specific interface. And don't use a class as the type for a type hinting. Specify an interface instead, and there's some documentation there. PHP indenting and whitespace, this is all important. We indent with 2 spaces, we don't use tabs in Drupal. Lines should have no trailing whitespace and should be no longer than 80 characters. Using your reasonable judgment, if there's a long function name or various definitions or declarations, you're obviously going to need some more space, but at your best, use no more than 80 characters. Files should use Unix line endings, not Windows line endings. Text files should end in a single new line, and binary operators should have a space on either side, as in the examples there. The standards on this particular screen have been around Drupal for a long time. A little bit more, unary operators should not have a space between the operator and the number or variable they affect. Put a space between the type and the $variable when casting a type. Use else if, not else if, with a space when this type of control structure is needed. When using a control structure, if, for, while, else if, switch, etc., have a space between the control keyword and the opening parentheses. Always use curly braces for control structures, even in situations where they're optional. YAML file syntax and standards. Whitespace is important. We use spacing and indentation to indicate how certain elements are related to one another. We've talked about that before. Again, when indenting, use 2 spaces for indentation levels. Don't use tabs. Some editors, such as Notepad++, will use tabs by default. Make sure you correct that. And anything that gets auto-corrected, make sure you correct that. In fact, I wouldn't even use Notepad++. I would use a much better text editor on Windows. Twig syntax, we won't be using much of it in this class, but there's some documentation at the link on the screen. And then documenting within code is really, really important because you may not be the last person that works on this code. So there's an example on the screen. Code documenting goes inside there. There's no white space between this code and the doc block above. Comments starting with 2 slashes or a /* with only 1 asterisk are not recognized as doc blocks in Drupal. Each line that starts with an asterisk, aside from the opening line, a paragraph break is denoted by a line with only a beginning asterisk and nothing else. Finally, here are some links to some great resources on all of these topics. 2 things to remember when you're writing your own module. You may not be the last person that works on this code, so documentation is important. Secondly, documentation is required if you're going to submit a module to the community. So don't underestimate the importance of documentation and document your modules well. Well, that's it. Take a look at those links, and then we'll be ready for our first module.